At the beginning of lab 6, we said that we had, for example, this list of numbers that is called course numbers, and we had this list of strings that is called course names. And we wanted to make something called list of tuples. In order to make this list of tuples, I told you that you have two ways to make the list of tuples. The first way, which was the one that is illustrated inside lab 6, which was the manual way. And the manual way was basically saying that you're gonna take each element from this list, for example, and pair it with the same element that is in the opposite list. Okay, so we're gonna take, for example, 101 and pair it with database, and we're gonna take 201 and we're gonna pair it with pen testing, and we're gonna take 301 and we're gonna pair it with operating system. These kind of pairs were actually tuples. That's why the thing that we have created, or the list that we have created, was called list of tuples. But the manual way to do this wasn't actually that practical. So just to remind you, we made something called list numbers names, and this is essentially was a list, as you can see from the square brackets. Inside this list, we said that we're going to have three pairs because we have three elements of this list and we have three elements in the opposite list. So by the end of the day, we're going to have three pairs, or in other words, three tuples. Each tuple or each pair is going to have one element from this list and one element from the opposite list. So we're gonna say, for example, the first pair is going to be 101 with the course database, okay? And we're gonna associate the 201 from course numbers list with the second element, which is the opposite element from the course names list, which is the course pen testing. And the final, or the third pair, is going to be 301 and operating system. And that was the manual way to create a list of tuples. Now, in the same video of the 6th lab, I told you that there is an automatic way to create these kind of pairs. There is an automatic way to create this list of tuples that you are seeing here without actually manually creating a list, then creating a tuple, and then associating each element by looking at this list with the other opposite element by looking at the other list. This video discusses the two methods that you can use to automatically create a list of tuples like this. The first method, let's gonna take this down there. The first method to create automatically a list of tuples like this, like the one that we have just created manually, is using something called the zip function. So what is exactly the zip function? The zip function basically takes like 2 lists, 3 lists, 4 lists, whatever number of lists that you can pass to the zip function, and it creates pairs out of these passed lists elements. So let's say, for example, that we are going to pass this list, which is called course numbers, and this list that is called course names into zip function. What is going to be returned from that zip function is something that looks exactly the same as this. It is going to return pairs from each element from both lists like this, and each pair is actually a tuple and is going to return by the end of the day a list of tuples, but that's like automatically created with the use of the zip function instead of doing something manually like that. So let's try the zip function. Let's say that this is the zip function, and let's give it the first list which is course. Let's say that we're gonna pass course numbers first, and let us pass the other one, or the other list that is called course names, and let us store whatever is going to be returned. Remember that the thing that's going to be returned by this zip function is something that is exactly identical to this. So this is going to return a list of tuples. Okay, so let's call, or let's store whatever that's going to be returned by the zip function in something called zipped list. Okay, now let's print zipped list and see what it actually includes. So let's run this. What you're seeing here is basically the address or the place of that zipped list. See, the zip function returns basically the address of the zipped list. What does the zip function do is that it creates something exactly like this. But what will the zip function return isn't directly this list of tuples. Instead, it's going to return the address of this list of tuples. In other words, where is that list of tuples is stored inside the memory. That's why you're seeing something like this hexadecimal value right here. Okay, in software engineering and in computer architecture, when you see something like this, some hexadecimal number like this is something that you should know that this references to, or this is something that refers to the address of that object inside the memory. So in order to get what is actually underneath this address, which is basically this list of tuples, you should cast this list of tuples into a list. So cast the returned address into a list, and this will get you the actual zipped list. Okay, so instead of printing the zipped list, we are going to cast this zipped list into a list like this. So let's cast a zipped list into a list, and now let's save it in another variable. Let's call it new zipped list. Okay, now let's try to print new zipped list, and let's run this. Now we're gonna see something that is exactly identical to the one that you've created manually, the list of tuples that you have created manually. Okay, and instead of doing this in 2 steps, we can actually do something like this. See, this is the zipped object, but what is returned from this zip function is basically the address of the list of tuples. In order to get what actually lies beneath or underneath this address, you need to cast it. So instead of doing this in 2 steps that I've, like the one that I've done here, I'm just going to cut this line because we don't need it, and we can actually cast whatever address that is going to be returned by this zip function at once like this. Now whatever that is going to be returned by the zip function, which is basically the address of the list of tuples, that is basically the location, where is it stored inside the memory, we're just going to take it and cast it or transform it into a list just in one go. Okay, so the thing that is going to be stored inside the zipped list is basically the resultant of the zipping of this list with this list. Okay, so now let's print zipped list like this and run this, and you're gonna see the same exact list of tuples that you have created manually here. Alright, so this is the first method. Now if you want to iterate through this, it's the same exact thing. If you remember what I told you in the 6th lab, I told you if you want to iterate over these elements, which is basically these tuples, you can use a for loop to say for x in course numbers and names, we can say something like print x. If you printed x, you're gonna see now is basically the tuples, because x represents the tuple, which is the element itself, which is in this case a tuple. So from this tuple, if you wanted to get the first element of each tuple, then you're gonna say x of 0, because remember x is now each tuple. X is each tuple from this list that we are iterating in. Okay, so from each tuple, which is x in this case, let's say we're going to get the first element, which is x of 0. Now we're going to get the first element of each tuple, which is 1, 1, 2, 1, then 3, 1. Alright, what if you want to get both? I told you that you can say for x of 1, which is basically it's the same tuple, but now I'm accessing from the same tuple x of 0, and from the same tuple I'm accessing x of 1. Now if you run this, you're gonna have x of 0 from each tuple, beside of it x of 1 from the same tuple, and this is going to go for each tuple that you have inside this list that you are iterating through. Okay, the same thing, the same exact thing goes when you zip to function using the zip function. Okay, I'm sorry, the same thing goes when you zip two lists using the zip function. So say this is the zipped list that you have actually that contains the list of tuples that the zip function has returned. Now we can use a for loop just the same way that we have used this for loop, but that was being used on this manual created list of tuple. Now we are creating this for loop to iterate over the zipped list, which is essentially the same thing as the course numbers names that we have created manually. Okay, so if you print now x, for example, you're gonna see it's the same exact thing. Okay, now if you want to get the first element from each tuple, you're gonna do the same thing, x of 0, and you're gonna do x of 1 to get the second element from the same tuple, so you end up with the same exact result. Alright, so this is the first method. Okay, now let's see the next method, or the second method to do this. Trial for by method 2. Now method 2 might sound a little bit hard, but believe me, it is not that hard. I'm just gonna revise some concept with you. When we have something like 4x and course numbers, or let's say course names for example, and we want to print x, basically what gets printed, is basically x is here each element from course name. So x is basically the first element, then the second element, then the third element. Okay, and that was using the for loop variable as the element itself, and I've discussed this in the fourth lab in detail. Now we can use the same for loop, but instead of saying for x in course names, you're gonna say for x in range. All right, now what we want to use the for loop as is basically using the for loop variable as the index of each element. So if you want to use the for loop variable, which is the x in this case, as the index of each element of a given list, where let's say that we are talking about course names in both case scenarios here, you need to provide the start index of the course names list to this range function, and the end element or the end index of this list to the range function. So the start index of this course names list that we want to iterate through using this loop is basically any list start at 0, right? And the ending element or the ending index of this list that is course names that we want to pass the range function is basically the index of 2. If you count this 0, 1, and 2. So you can do something like this, because if you did this, you have only 0 and 1. So you have the indices of the first two elements only, 0 and 1, and you don't have 2. So basically, you increase the end with 1 because the end in the range function is not included with you. But something like this is not really it's really not that dynamic. So in order to make it as dynamic as possible, and instead of providing 3 like this, what happens if you increased this course names into like 4 courses, something like data structures or something? Now this list contains four elements, so you're not going to manually go here and say something like 0 and 4 to make it 0 1 2 0 1 2 3. Okay, you don't have to do it manually. Instead, you can get the length of this list. Yeah, so let's just return this to 3 elements. We can actually provide the length of the given list. Instead of saying from 0 to 3, we can say from 0 to the final element of this course names list. Now, the length of this list is basically 3. So what's going to be returned by this length of course names is 3. And what we need to access, like index speaking, is the index of 0, then the index of 1, then the index of 2. So from 0 to 3 we have 0, 1, 2, and this is what we need to access this element. These are the indices that we need. Okay, so the length returns 3. Alright, now remember, the variable of the for loop is basically the index of each element. If you have the index of each element, when you print x, now x is not the element itself, unlike the case here. Okay, in this case, x is basically the element itself, because I've said for x in the list directly. But when you say for x in range from 0 to the final element of a given list, you're saying that now x is basically the index. Okay, so if you run this, what's going to be printed from the next loop is basically the index from 0 to 2. Okay, the indices of these elements. Okay, what happened if you want to get the element directly, not the index of these elements? So instead of printing x, which is basically the index, you're gonna print from course names. Okay, the element that actually correspond to this index. So you're saying something like, get me the element that lies in under this index from the list that is called course names. So in the first iteration, x is going to be 0, right? So x of 0, this is going to return database. In the second iteration, x is going to be increased. Remember, this range is actually from 0 to 2. So in the second iteration, x is going to be incremented, which is the index, by 1. So you have course names. This gets you pen testing. And the range actually is 0, 1, 2. So the next increment to the x, which is going to be in the third iteration, is going to be 2. So course names of 2, this gets you operating system. Okay, so let's put this as it was, like course name of x, and run this. This is going to get you the same 3 elements, just as exactly using for x in course names. Now, if you don't understand this completely, please go back to lab 4 and you're gonna see me explaining everything regarding these two parts in details. Okay, so why am I telling you about this method if we have this actually doing the trick? It's because of the second method that we are going to use. The second method is basically manually, like, I'm not gonna say manually, but let's say manually creating a list of tuples. Now, how can we do this? The second method actually is heavily relied on this concept of using the for loop variable to access the indices of a given list and pass this index into the list in order to get the corresponding element. This concept here is what we're going to use in the second method. So let's delete this, and I'm going to comment this out. Now let's go back to our main objective, which is basically creating a list of tuples or pairing these two lists together. Okay, so we can say something like, let's say that we're gonna have course names, numbers. Let's call it numbers names. We want to have the numbers first, and this is gonna be an empty list. All right. Now let's make a for loop and say this for loop Okay, so let's create a for loop. The thing is that we are going to create 3 pairs from each 2 elements. Why is that? Because each list that we are using is basically 3 elements. So we're going to end up with 3 pairs. This is the first pair, and this is the second pair, and this is the third pair. Yeah, so the for loop is going to run for 3 times. Okay, so for xn range, remember this is the concept of the for loop that you are using the for loop as a counter or as the indices itself, name it whatever you want to name it, but we're not using the for loop to access the element themselves. We're just using the for loop as a counter, a number counter, or an index counter. Okay, so for x in range from 0 until the end of this list. Okay, listen, we don't really care about which list that we are working on, because by the end of the day, we just want to use the for loop here as an index counter. So if you look at this list, this has 3 indices. And if you looked at this list as well, it has 3 indices. So it doesn't really matter if you say something like the range function is going to be the indices starting index 0 till the last element of this list, which is course names, or this list, which is course numbers. Both of them are going to work because basically both of them has the same number of elements and the same length. Okay, so if you're gonna say for x in range from 0 to length of course numbers or length of course names, both are essentially the same, because most importantly, both of them are basically the same length. Both of them are going to return a length of 3. They have 3 elements. So now that the index counter is ready, let's say that x, now just remember something, that x, which is the loop variable or the iterator, is going to be at the first iteration 0, then it's going to be 1, then it's going to be 2, which is basically the indices in this list and the indices in this list. Since we have the indices of both lists, let's say now something like this. Let's say that we are going to create a tuple, all right? Let's call it just tub, like this, okay? Or just let's say that this is pair. It's just a variable name, okay? So the pair is basically going to be something like the first element of this list and the first element of this list. Basically, the first element of both lists lies under the index of 0, right? So we can say we are going to access course numbers, okay? We are going to access basically the first element of course numbers, and comma, we're going to access the second element of course, or sorry, we're going to access the first element again, but from course names. Okay, now if you notice something, I don't really need to put a 0 here. I just put this just for you to understand what I'm doing. So basically this pair in this first iteration is going to be the first element of course numbers, which is basically 101, okay, comma, the other element that's going to be stored within pair is going to be the first element from course names, which is basically database. Okay, the only thing that is left is to include them inside a tuple using this parentheses like this. So what is going to be stored inside this pair variable is basically a tuple, just as you can see these parentheses here. It's going to be a tuple that is going to be stored inside the pair variable, a tuple of the first element of course numbers list and the first element of course names list. Okay, but instead of using this fixed or static index that I'm using here, 0, 0, we're going to use this iterator. Remember, we are inside a for loop, so we might as well use this x, which actually represents the index counter. So instead of having zeros, we're going to say x like that. Okay, so in the first iteration where x is going to be the first index in the range from 0 to 2, x is going to be the first index, which is actually 0. So basically, the first tuple that is going to be stored inside pair is going to be course of numbers when x is 0, which is 101, and course names where x is 0, which is basically database. So this is the first tuple or the first pair that we are going to store inside this variable. Okay, once you have this pair or this tuple, now we can append it into this empty list that we have created here in line 12. So if you have this tuple stored inside pair, now let's say that inside course numbers names, we are going to append this tuple, which is basically inside the pair variable. Now this is the first iteration. The second iteration, where x is going to be the next element generated from this range function, which is basically 1, x is going to be the index of 1. The pair is going to be the tuple from course numbers when x is equal to 1, meaning the second element from course numbers. So this is the first element that is stored inside this tuple, okay, this part here. And the second element from course numbers when x is equal to 1. Here x equals to 1. So the element that we're looking for in course names that we are accessing here is actually pen testing. So I might as well just edit this. So this is the tuple that's going to be stored inside pair in the second iteration. Once this tuple is stored inside pair, take that pair and append it into course numbers and names. And the third iteration where x is going to be 2, which is basically the last number generated by the range function. Let's say that we are creating a tuple. Okay, the first element of this tuple is basically the element of course numbers that is at the index of 2. Okay, so the element that is at the index of 2 is basically the third element of course numbers, which is basically 301. So let's put 301 here. Okay, and the second element of this tuple that we are storing inside pair is basically course numbers at the index of 2, and course numbers at the index of 2 is basically operating system. So this is what's going to be, this tuple is what's going to be stored inside pairs. Now once this pair is ready, let's go to line 16 and append this pair into course numbers names. So by the end of the day, we should have the same exact list of tuples that we have created manually here and that we have created using this zip list right here. Okay, so if we printed now course numbers names, we should see the exact same list of tuples. Okay, so these are the two methods that you can use to automatically create a list of tuples. The first one, which is in my opinion the easiest one, which is basically zipping two lists using the zip function, then casting whatever is returned by this zip function into a list in order to have a list of tuples and store it inside a variable. Then you can iterate over this zipped list just as the same way that you iterate over a manually created list of tuples, like the one that we've created here. The next method is basically manually, I don't know if tupling was a word, but manually tupling or pairing two elements. Okay, manually pairing two elements from two lists. So how about we make this useful for you? We want to make this as useful as possible regarding the case scenario that you're having in your assignments question. Okay, so I'm going to create a new script. I'm just going to close this. I'm going to create a new script. Let's call it using functions or using funcs.py. Okay, so let's try to make a function that creates two lists. Okay, the first list is basically list 1, which is going to be events from user, and list 2 is going to be odds from user. Okay, so let's say that this is the first function, events odds from user. Okay, so we are going essentially to ask the user to enter even and odd numbers. But the thing is, for how many times? This is the argument that the user should provide. So basically, the user should actually provide an argument to this function, say that the user wants to generate, for example, 3 evens and 3 odds. The most important rule in this function is that evens should be the same number of elements as the odds. Say that you have like 3 even numbers, you should have 3 odd numbers. Okay, that's the trick here. So they both should have the same number of elements, or basically the same length, like this. Okay, so we are going to provide this argument for the user. So let's say that you're going to take a parameter that represents the number of times that we are going to ask the user to enter an even, or the number of times that we are going to ask the user to enter the odds. So let's say that this is, for example, count. Now we're going to make a for loop. Let's create 2 empty lists. Let's call the first one is basically evens, and the other one, let's call it odds. Okay, so let's say for x in range, yeah, starting from 0. Listen, this loop, I'm using this loop as a number counter. Do not forget this. A number counter. So I want this loop to run for how many times the user would want it to run. For example, the user would run this function and give the count, like for example, 3. So this loop should run 3 times. Or if the user gave the count as 4, then the loop should run for 4 times. So whatever the count will be, this loop should run. Okay, so let's say that for x in range from 0 to count, okay, we are going to ask the user to enter input. It's gonna tell him enter an even number. I just want to make things as simple as possible, so I'm not going to put a check whether the number that the user will enter is even or not. I'm just gonna assume that the user knows what he's doing, and he's gonna enter an even number eventually and an odd number eventually. Okay, so remember, these are numbers, so I'm just gonna cast this into an int in one go. And let's actually take all of this and just append it inside, or let's take it like, let's do it in 2 steps, just to not confuse you. Let's take this inside, for example, num, let's call it even num. Okay, so once we take this, let's append this inside evens, even num. Okay, so if the user decided to enter like a count of, for example, 4, then this input function will appear to the user 4 times, asking him to enter 4 different even numbers. We're gonna need the same for loop, but in order to input from the user or take from the user the odd numbers. So for x in range from 0 to count, notice how I used the same count in both loops, because I want the evens to be having the same number of elements as the odds. Okay, so I'm gonna ask the user to enter an odd number this time. I'm going to tell him input enter an odd number. Okay, again, I'm assuming that the user knows that he should enter an odd number here and an even number there. I'm not going to put any conditions or if statements to check anything. Okay, so let's say odds append whatever input the user will enter, and that is going to be stored inside odd num. Okay, once this function finishes taking inputs and storing them inside evens, and once it finishes taking inputs and storing them inside odds, I'm just going to return both lists. Let's say that the list that I'm returning is basically the evens and the odds. Okay, so now let's get out of the loop, or the function, I'm sorry. We're gonna get out of the function like this, and I'm going to say, for example, number of times, where I'm going to ask the user to how many times or how many even odd numbers would, come on, you like to generate. Okay, and remember, that's the count that we are going, this is the same exact count parameter that we are going to pass to this function that we will eventually call it right now. Okay, so let's just cast this into an integer, because this is going to be a number. And now let's call the function that is evens odds and give it the number of times that the user will specify. Okay, this number of times is going to be substituted inside this count parameter when this function is called. Okay, and remember, this function returns something, so I'm going to store this return inside let's call it result. That's okay, let's call it result. Okay, and by the end of the day, let's print result. Just going to decide that I'm going to enter, for example, let's make it something less this time. We're going to generate 4 evens and 4 odds, so I'm entering the count to be 4. Okay, so the first even number is going to be 0, 2, 4, and 6. Now we're gonna enter the odd numbers, so the first odd number is going to be 1, 3, and we have 5, then 7. This is the list returned, which is the events that we have actually inputted, and this is the list that we have returned, which is basically the odds that we have entered as inputs as well. Okay, now the question is, what if you want to make another function that sums the elements from both lists together? Okay, together. Okay, meaning that I want to have a summation or a list of submissions that the first submission is going to be 0 plus 1, which is 1, and the second submission is going to be 2 plus 3, which is 5, and the third submission is going to be 4 plus 5, which is 9, and the final submission is going to be 6 plus 7, which is 13. Okay, so how can we do this? Now let's first of all let's make the function. Okay, let's say that this function, let's define it as sum of each, let's say sum of both lists. Okay, and let's pass two lists to this function. Let's pass, for example, list 1, and let's pass list 2, because we are getting the summation of elements of both lists, the parallel indices we're going to sum. Okay, for example, this list, as I've told you, the index of 0, which is 0 and 1, and the index of 1 in both lists, which is 2 and 3, and the index of 2 of both lists, which is 4 and 5, and etc. We're gonna like sum the equal indices from each list. Alright, so this sum of both lists actually is waiting for two lists to be passed into it. Okay, so instead of having this result, I'm just gonna make it like pass. Let me run this one more time. Okay, let's for example generate 3 evens and 3 odds. Okay, so the first even, second even, third even, first odd. We're having a tuple of both lists. Remember, when you return multiple elements, Python combine these multiple elements as a tuple because you're having a comma right there. That's why a tuple is basically, as you can see from these parentheses here and there, a tuple is the thing that is stored inside result. Okay, so we can unpack this. We can unpack this tuple. See, this is the tuple returned. We can unpack it to make the first, for example, the first list to be stored in result 1, or let's make it even list, comma, let's make another variable and call it even or odd list to store the second list inside of it, inside odd list. If you don't remember this, please go back to the 5th lab. I believe it was the 5th lab where I talked about unpacking values. So just revisit the 5th lab and you're gonna see everything that I've talking about here inside the video. Okay, so now this function should take two lists, which are basically the even list that we have unpacked from this function and the odd list that we have unpacked from this function. All right, so once we have these two lists, we can use one of two methods in order to zip or link or pair the elements from this list with this list. Okay, so let's take the first method and let's call this function, for example, version 1. The first method 1 to pair each list elements that we're going to use is the zip function, the first method that we have talked about inside this video. Okay, so let's use the zip function and let's say zipped list is going to be the pairing or the zipping of list 1 that we are going to pass to this function with list 2 that we are going also to pass to this function. And remember, this will return the address of the zipped list. Now we want to have the actual zipped list, so you need to cast it into a list like this. Okay, and let's store this inside zipped list. Now zipped list is basically the list of tuples of these lists like this. Okay, so let's just print. So let's print this zipped list now to see what is actually created from this zip function. So let's call now sum of both lists version 1 and give it the list that we got from this function, which is evens odd from user. Let's pass even list and let's give it odd list. Okay, and let us print the even list and the odd list just to know what we are dealing with before anything. Okay, now let's call this, or let's run this. Let's give it 3 elements, 3 evens and odds. 0, 2, 4, 1, 3, 5. Notice that this is the even list returned inside even list from this function call, and this is the odd list returned from this function call and saved inside odd list. And this basically, this output here is the output of this print function. Now the most important thing, look at the last output in the terminal that is basically corresponding to the print inside this function. The function that is called sum of both lists has this print function, okay, which actually prints the zipped list that we created from the zip function. If you look at this, you're going to see that the zip function has created a list of tuples where each tuple is the pairing of each element from this list with this list. Okay, is the pairing, just to be specific, is the pairing of each element from this list and this list, which actually lies in the same index or in the same position. For example, the first pair has the first element of both lists, which is 0 and 1. Okay, the second pair has the second element of both lists, which is 2 and 3, and the third pair has the third element of both lists, which is 4 and 5. All right, so the zipped list has now something like this. It has the list of tuples. It has a list of tuples like that. Okay, and what we wanted essentially to do is basically to add the element from this list with the element from this list, and add 2 to 3 and add 4 to 5 like that, right? Now once we have this list of tuples, now we can make a for loop to actually iterate over this list of tuples, which is stored inside the zipped list. Okay, now X is basically each tuple of this zipped list, right? So if X is basically each tuple of this list, what we want to do is basically add each element or add both elements of the same tuple together, and add those both elements from the same tuple together, and add these two elements from this tuple together. So we can say now something like this: print, or let's make a list that is called sums, for example, sums, and make it an empty list like that. And let's say that sums is going to be having x of 0 plus x of 1 appended to it. Okay, by the end of the day, let's print the sums. Okay, now let's run this. Let's satisfy this function call and give it 3. We wish to generate 3 even and odds. 0, 2, 4, 1, 3, 5, and this is the even list and this is the odd list. All right, and this is the list of tuples that contain an even, an odd, the second even, the second odd, the third even, and the third odd. Okay, and finally the summation of each element. When you sum 0 and 1, which is basically the first tuple, you get 1. When you sum 2 and 3, which is basically this tuple, you get 5. When you sum 4 and 5, okay, which is basically this tuple, you get 9. Okay, now this sounds easy. How about we make something like a table that contains the elements being summed and their sum. So let's make the table like this. Let's say that the table is going to be elements like this and sum. Okay, so we are going to say for xn, and let's say that this is, for example, okay, that's enough. Let's say for xn sums, for example. Yeah. Now you should think about the for loop here. You want to create a table, okay, and this table will contain in the first row, for example, this double in a column, and the column next to it in the same row is going to have 1. Okay, the next row is going to have this double, and the column next to it of the same row is going to have 5. The next row is going to have this column right here, this double, and the column next to it of the same row is going to have 9. Okay, basically here each sum is the same number of each double. Yeah, so you would want the for loop to run for the same length of the summations or the same length of the list of tuples, which is basically 3 in both cases. Okay, so instead of using for xn sum, we're gonna say for xn range from 0 to length of whatever list. Okay, because length of this list of tuple, which is basically the zip list, is 3, and the length of the summations, which is sums, is also 3. So let's make it length of sums. You can make it length of zipped list. It's the same. So this is going to run for 3 times 0, 1, 2, because we have 3 elements here or 3 elements there. All right. So now let's say that we are going to print the first element, which is going to be the tuple itself from the zipped list. Okay, so the first element, for example, which is x at 0, then we are going to print the summation itself from the sums. Okay, or the first element from the sums. Let's say sums of x, which is in the first iteration going to be 0. The second iteration, x is going to be 1, 1. The third iteration is going to be 2, 2. Okay, so now let's run this. Let's say 3, and there is some formatting problem. I'm just gonna remove one tab like this. Let's run this one more time, and it should do the trick. Okay, you might want to have some equal signs right there. Let's give it something like 20. And for the last time, okay, so this is the table that you want to generate, and this is the first version of sum of both lists. You can make another version which is actually not using the first method that we have discussed in this video, but the second method. Okay, so I'm going to make another function, and I'm going to call it sum of both lists, but version 2, and it takes 2 lists as well, list 1 and list 2, like this. Okay, the most important thing here is to have, by the end of the day, a table like this. Okay, the video that I have uploaded regarding the guidelines or how to get full credit in your programming question assignment, I showed something like this. I showed you a table when I was talking about the submission. Yeah, I showed you something like that. So in order to get this trial, saying that this trial contains the roll of the first die and the roll of the second die, and these are the summation of the 2 rolls, which is 12, and this is the second trial, which is actually contains the roll of the first die and the roll of the second die and its summation, the roll of the first die and the roll of the second die in the third trial here, and this is its summation. You're gonna see that this actually goes in the same exact fashion as the thing that we have created here. So this was just a hint. What I've done here is just basically a hint for you in order to get full credit in this first question. And as I've told you in the on how to get full credit in your program question of the assignment, you can actually stick to having the sum column, this column printed in your text file. You can actually you can actually stick with this. This is enough. Okay, this is accepted to have this third column as the sum, the only thing printed in your text file. But of course, if I found someone who's having a print like that, having that, for example, we have 10 trials, we have rolled the 2 dice for like 10 times or 10 trials, and these are the trial for each toss that we have done. Like we have tossed the 2 dice, and in the first trial, for example, we have tossed 6, and we have rolled 6, and the submission is 2. If I found someone making something like this, of course he's gonna get full credit. Okay, of course it's going to be somehow privileged because he have done a step that no one has ever done. Okay, so in order to know how you can do this, this is basically the hint that you need in this video. Alright, so let's go to the second method. If you want to use the second method that I've talked to you about, it was actually in trial 4, which is basically semi-manually creating a list of tuple using a loop like this. So instead, I'm going to make a function that actually I'm going to name it version2, and it takes 2 lists as well. Alright, what will you do with these 2 lists? We're going to create a for loop, let's say for xn range, and let's say that this loop is going to run for the indices of this list or this list. Remember, the most important thing is that these 2 lists need to be of the same length. So if you said from index 0 till the last index of list 1 or till the last index from list 2, it wouldn't really matter. It's the same thing essentially because they have the same length. Alright, so if you have the loop running from the first index to whatever number of indices or number of elements that you have in list 1 or list 2, now we can start working. So we can say that we will create manually a tuple, and let us call it pair, just as the example that we have done like 10 minutes ago in this video, like here. Okay, so this pair is going to be a tuple which contains an element from list 1 at some certain index, and at the same index I'm going to take an element from list 2. Okay, so this pair is basically your tuple, and let us, before the loop, create a list of tuples. Let's call it list of tuples. Okay, I can't call it zip list, but I don't want to call it zip list because I'm using this naming convention when I'm using the zip function. So let's call it list of tuples, like that. Alright, now we're gonna say inside list of tuples we're gonna append pair. Okay, this 4 lines right there is basically the equivalent to this line right here. So whatever suits you, just use it. Okay, now once we have the zipped list or the list of tuples, which is basically going to be something exactly like this list right here, this is what's going to be stored after the appending inside list of tuples. Now we can iterate over this list of tuples and actually get the submission, right? So, and actually, instead of using 2 loops like the 2 loops that I've done inside this function version 1, here I've made a loop that calculates the sum and appends the sum of each tuple from this zipped list inside the sums list. Then I've created another loop to print this table that you're seeing right there. Okay, you can make a loop that actually has both things, that actually sums and creates the table in the same time. So we can say, for example, for xn, let's say for xn range, remember this tuple, I'm sorry, this table that you are generating is basically dependent on the number of tuples or on the number of submissions. They're essentially the same. Okay, the submissions are basically the same number of tuples. So this loop is going to work as a counter that is starting from index 0 till the last index, which is the length of list of tuples. Okay, here I've made it the length of sums, and I told you could have just used it the length of zipped list. It's the same thing. Okay, so now we can say f string, the first thing that you're printing inside this tuple. Let's just take this header to print function, which is basically the header of my table. Okay, this is the header and this is the equal signs. All right, now here your table starts actually. So the first thing that's going to be beneath elements, which is basically each tuple, which is basically the elements of this list tuple. So you're gonna say list tuple, list tuples. Let's just make it list tuples. Okay, of x. I'm just gonna print this. Let's first call the function. I'm just making just kind of separator like that. Now let's call the function that is called sum both lists version 2 and give it even list odd list. Or you know what, I'm just going to comment this out. Alright, now we are calling version 2, alright guys? Now let's run this. Okay, so we're generating 3 odds and evens. These are the evens and these are the odds. Notice that we are getting the tuples, alright? So we're saying for x in range from 0 to the last index of this list that is called list of tuples, and we are accessing each element of this list of tuples by actually providing the index. Okay, so remember, this is the list of tuples that we are iterating through. Okay, and we are iterating through this list of tuples, but as index, and we are passing each index to this list of tuples. So in the first iteration, x is going to be 0, so list of tuples when the element is at the index of 0, so this is the tuple that we're having here. Okay, the second iteration, x is going to be incremented by 1, so list of tuples, the element where list of tuples at index of 1, which is basically this is index of 1, the second element, that's the tuple that we are having in the terminal. And since this list of tuples that we are iterating through is basically 3 elements only, then the last iteration where x is going to be 2, list of tuples 2 is going to get you the element at the index of 2, which is 4 and 5. Okay, so now this for loop actually generates this table. It generates the elements inside in the form of tuples under this column, which is the elements column. In order to generate the summations of these elements inside each tuple under the sum column, for example, in the first row we should have the summation of 1, the second row we should have the summation of 5, the third row we should have the summation of 9. In order to generate the summations under the sum column, all we need to do is just make a tab here, right, and make a curly brace, and now we're getting the summation of the elements in this tuple. Remember that this is your tuple now, right? This is the tuple that you're working on right now. So from this tuple, which is first basically in the first iteration, for example 0 and 1, from this tuple get me, for example, the first element, which is 0. So from this tuple get me the first element, and from the same tuple get me the second element, which is at index of 1, which is basically 1 in this case. Okay, so I'm now adding from the first tuple, or from this tuple, the element as at index 0 or on the element at index 1 from the same tuple. That's the first iteration. In the second iteration, you're going to have the list of tuples of x, that's your tuple, which is 2 and 3. So from 2 and 3 I'm getting the index of 0. Okay, and from 2 and 3, which is the same tuple, which is list of tuples of x, I'm getting the element at the index of 1, which is the second element, which is basically 3. So I'm now adding 2 and 3, and in the last iteration, which is the third iteration, or the third element, or the third tuple, I'm saying that I'm getting from the tuple 4 and 5 the first element, which is 4. Okay, plus I'm getting from list of tuples of x, which is the tuple 4 and 5, the second element, which is at index of 1, which is 5. So 4 plus 5 is going to get you 9. Now if you run this, you should have, let's first enter the evens and odds. So this is my evens and this is my odds. You should have the same exact result that we got from the first version. Alright, I'm doing all of this in order for you to get a hint on how can you get full credit on this first branch, which is I believe this is branch A in the question, in the third question of your assignment. Okay, or branch B. Yeah, branch A was actually simulating the two dice rolls, or it was simulation of thousands of trials for both dice rolls. and branch B was basically creating the summation of those trials that we have from both dice, and then storing this or writing this into a file. What I've done here is basically the same exact thing, but instead of writing into a file, which is going to be actually your task, I just printed everything inside my terminal. So I hope this gave you a clear idea of what you're supposed to do if you want to get full credit and have a print that looks exactly like this. Okay?